Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Cywes. I am the Carb Addiction Doc, and today we're going to discuss fat. Not this fat, but fat in our diet. And it is one of the things that's been most misrepresented and most causative of all the harm and all the goodness in our nutritional world. And I want you to listen through this. I'm going to take you through somebody else's story, because they've done it better than I can do it. Same stuff that we do all the time, but the comprehensive understanding is important. And this is something that I printed off and I wrote up here, as I often do, just says brilliant. I can't do better. I can add, I can adjunct a little bit, but I can't do better. This is a Monday letter from a woman by the name of Zoe Harcombe, Ph.D. She's a doctor living in England, and she puts these out every Monday, and I would urge you to subscribe to her Monday letter. It's free, it is phenomenal, but I want to take you through this because she and I are so aligned. We are friends, and I've written some book chapters for her, but absolutely brilliant work on this. And we want to understand saturated fat and put it into context, because more so than anything else, the world out there is erroneously obsessed with lipids. So let's go through fat. There are three types of fat, folks. There's saturated fat, there's polyunsaturated fat, and monounsaturated fat. And you're going to hear those all the time. And words like good and bad fats are going to be assigned to that. The truth is, it's just about the chemical structure of the fat. And saturated fat just has single little bonds between carbon, 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 carbon. They're chains of carbon with hydrogen and oxygen on them. And saturated fat has single chains. What the word unsaturated means is there's a double chain. And those double chains are a little bit unstable. Monounsaturated means there's one double chain. Polyunsaturated means there's more than two, and it doesn't matter how many above that. Now, here's a lot of the myths that we have. Number one, almost every food that we eat contains fat. Whether it's broccoli, Brussels sprouts, strawberries, ribeye steak, lard. Almost all food contains fat. A strawberry, for example, contains about 0.5 gram of fat. Almost all food contains fat, some fat. It's in everything we eat. Secondly, almost all food has all three. Almost all food has saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, and monounsaturated fat. Now, why then do so many people make so much noise about saturated fat? Because they're uneducated, knee-jerking alarmists. So let's break this down. Human beings must consume fat. It is an essential source of energy. But more important than energy, every single cell is made of fat. Every cell is made of fat. Every membrane is made of fat inside the cell and on the outside of the cell. Fat is essential not only for energy, but essential for cellular structure. Without fat, we don't exist. So fat must be consumed by human beings, without which we die. Therefore, it is essential. And there are two specific categories of fat that are essential that we have to consume, which are 3 and 6 omega fatty acids. And both of those are polyunsaturated fatty acids. Polyunsaturated fatty acids. Okay? There's plenty of talks on my channel about those. We're not going to talk about those. Okay? But let's break down the 3 saturated fats. All food that contains fat, plant or animal in origin, contains all 3 of the natural fatty acids. Now, there is only one food group, and I want you to guess along with me as I pose these questions. There's only one food group that actually contains more saturated fat than unsaturated fat, and that is dairy. Dairy. And every mammal exists because of dairy. No mammal can exist without dairy. Now, human beings have developed some dairy substitutes, but it's still dairy-based. So dairy that every mammal exists because of contains a high amount of saturated fat. That's incongruous. The very thing that makes us alive, the very thing that makes us a species, is being told by all those experts out there, oh, you're wrong, that dairy is so bad for you. Saturated fat is really bad for you. Well, God and nature must be trying to kill us because those experts have told us saturated fat is bad for us. You see the conundrum? Probably God and nature aren't wrong. Probably not. But maybe the experts are right and God and nature are wrong. God and nature is trying to kill us. So there are foods, there are individual foods that contain more saturated fat as well. The single food or the single thing that we consume with the highest amount of saturated fat, which is coconut oil. Coconut oil is almost pure saturated fat. So again, if saturated fat is so bad for us, why do the vegan plant-based diet people so heavily promote coconut oil as being this wonderful, healthy, mystical, perfect elixir of life? Because that's vegan. Coconut oil is vegan. And yet it's all saturated fat. See how screwed up their logic is? Because when your doctor tells you, oh, saturated fat's so bad for you, ask them, what about coconut oil? Oh, excellent, very good. Put it on your lettuce, put it on your salad. But coconut oil is saturated fat. You just told me not to eat saturated fat. Come on, man. But see, they don't know that. They're knee-jerking. And in fact, even coconut oil is 87% saturated, 6% monounsaturated, and 2% polyunsaturated. And as I said, all foods have at least a trace of fat. So once we look at the different structures of fat, okay, let's look at meat. Let's look at meat. And this again is, well, I'm going to ask some questions. Let's look at steak. Let's look at a neutral steak, a sirloin steak. Or you can look at a ribeye steak, or you can look at a filet. I don't care. Any animal product. What by far is the largest component of any animal product? Answer that question. Well, if you really want to think about it, we are animals. Some of us more so than others, but we are animals. What is the largest component of our bodies? About 70% of all animals is water. So when you're looking at that steak, at that chicken breast, that piece of fish, at that pork chop, 70% of it is water. Water. That leaves 30%. And what's interesting is the protein component of almost all foods, whether it's vegetables or whether it is animal products, is about the same. It's about 15%. Yep. Now, for certain animal products like steak and that kind of thing, it's a little higher. It's about 21%. So your typical sirloin steak is about 21 to 22% protein. Only 1/5 of a steak is actually protein. So when you use the word, I'm going to eat my protein, what you're actually saying is I'm going to drink my water and there's a little bit of protein in it. And the protein from steak typically contains all 21 amino acids that the human body needs. That's why animal products are better than protein in a shake, which only contain a few amino acids. We need all 21. They're not all essential, but we need them in that combination. So if 70% of a steak is water and 21% of it is protein, and about 2% is ash and minerals and vitamins and trace elements, that leaves us a very, very small fraction of a ribeye steak or a sirloin steak as fat. In fact, the average steak has about 7 to 8% of its total volume as fat. Oh, I'm going to eat this fatty ribeye steak. Well, it's basically water, some protein, and then a little bit of fat. Even if you can see that visible fat, it may go up in a really fat ribeye steak to 9 or 10%. It's still a hell of a lot less than the protein. Still less than a half to a third of protein. That's how much fat everybody out there is beating us up about. Now, when you break down that fat, let's look at the fat. Let's look at the fat in your steak. Let's call it 7%. 7% of the fat in a sirloin, 7% of a sirloin steak is fat. How much of that is that really bad, dangerous, saturated fat? About 2%. 2.5% is saturated fat. So of this enormous steak that you're eating that is so bad for you because red meat's going to kill you, number one, protein is 21%, fat is 7%, and only 2% is the saturated fat that's going to clog your arteries by what they tell us. See the BS in this, folks? And in fact, if you break that steak down, about 39% of the fat, of that 7%, about 39%, 40% is saturated fat. 56% is monounsaturated fat, which they tell us is so healthy for us. So the majority of the fat in a steak is monounsaturated fat, which is what they tell us is the healthy fat. And about 6 to 10% is polyunsaturated fat, which they also tell us, eat margarine, not butter, is healthy for us. Even lard, pure fat, 100% fat. 100% of lard is fat. 40% is saturated fat. Close to 50% is monounsaturated fat. And about 12 to 15% is polyunsaturated fat. Lard, pork fat, tallow, beef fat, ghee. Most of it is polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fat. 55 to 60%. You see how screwed up their information? They don't even have this as information. All they've got is knee-jerk sound bites. And yet they're telling, because of their influential position as healthcare providers, they're telling us we must not eat saturated fat. We shouldn't be eating red meat. We should be eating more plants. Absolutely ridiculous. And then even within our own community, there's now a group of people, because we've become so, polyunsaturated fats are so bad, PUFAs are so bad. They're in everything we eat, folks. And now the purists who, again, don't have the knowledge. Oh, don't eat chicken, don't eat pork because the polyunsaturated fatty acid content is high. Yes, chicken breast, 24% is polyunsaturated fat. Pork, 16 to 20%. Bacon. All meat has polyunsaturated fatty acids in it. Don't be dumb, folks. Don't be dumb. Have knowledge. Don't be dumbed into this. So, if we look at those percentages, then we can see that saturated fat is never more than 50% of anything that we eat, even lard. That means it's never the majority of fat in anything that we eat. And in most cases, except for lamb, the main fat in meat is monounsaturated fat, the same fat that they tell us is so healthy for us. Even where saturated fat is the main fat, such as in lamb, there is more unsaturated fat than saturated fat overall. See the bullshit of what they try and tell us? Because they don't know this, they don't have this knowledge. It is quite incredible when you actually look at what they're telling us and how wrong they are, and yet how important it is that we take our statins. And we don't eat meat and we eat more plants. Absolutely crazy. So now let's go down their theory of why saturated fat is harmful anyway. Because clearly what they're telling us is saturated fat is so bad for you, yet I'm not eating that much, even if I'm eating a damn ribeye steak. I'm eating more of what you tell me to eat, and yet you're telling me I shouldn't be eating what I'm eating. So, we've explained the facts about fat and what saturated fat is and what is in meat. We've shown that meat is not full of saturated fat. In fact, it's the smaller part of all the fat in the meat. The final point is that it wouldn't matter if meat were full of saturated fat anyway. Let's assume they're right. Let's assume the steak I'm eating is actually pure saturated fat. How harmful is that saturated fat? Well, the case that they present is that eating too much saturated fat in your diet can raise bad LDL and bad cholesterol in your blood. First of all, we haven't even talked about cholesterol. Cholesterol is a separate molecule that is not fat. It is not fat. Cholesterol is something completely different. It isn't even fat, but your LDL cholesterol, when you eat all the saturated fat, goes up and it increases the risk of heart attacks and strokes. That's what they tell us. So their standard line is eating too much saturated fats in your diet can raise your bad LDL cholesterol in your blood, which can increase your risk of a heart attack and a stroke. That's what they base all their treatment on. That's the lipid heart hypothesis. And the burden on proof is not in us in the ketogenic space to say that saturated fat is harmless. The burden of proof should be on them to prove that it's harmful. Show us that it's harmful. So the first question you ask them is, okay, how does saturated fat raise LDL cholesterol? How does that happen? See my answer? See my answer? Because there is no plausible scientific, biologic, biochemical way in which saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol. Because that's an insulin resistance problem. It doesn't happen. So if they come up with any theory, they're lying to you, they're making it up. Because there is no biology that takes us from saturated fat to an elevated LDL cholesterol. What about all the LMHRs, the LDL cholesterol through the roof? They eat a lot of fat. So the second question you want to ask, and I'll explain that to you in a second, but the second question you want to ask is, okay, let's assume for a second that you're right. Eating saturated fat raises your LDL cholesterol and increases the risk of heart disease. How does that saturated fat increase the risk of heart disease and a stroke? How does that happen? Well, they claim that saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol and that causes cardiovascular disease. But if saturated fat consumption doesn't lead to cardiovascular disease, their hypothesis clearly fails. So when you look at all the evidence, all the trials, all the work around dietary fats, and this is what Zoe Harcombe did really well in her Ph.D. thesis. She examined all those studies. And this is the point you want to make to them. There is zero evidence. There is zero evidence that reducing saturated fat intake reduces heart disease. Reduction in saturated fat consumption does not reduce heart disease because it doesn't cause the heart disease. When saturated fat was replaced with unsaturated fat, it did not reduce the risk of heart disease. It did result in lower total cholesterol. However, it made absolutely no difference to mortality from either heart disease, stroke, or all-cause mortality. So how does the consumption of saturated fat in the absence of glucose? And that's the key word, folks. That's the key word. Remember, I said I was going to answer this question for you. Because eating fat raises LDL cholesterol. Yes, it does. Yes, it absolutely does. Yes, it does. But only in the absence of carbohydrates. When you eat a lot of carbohydrates and you are insulin resistant, your body's living on sugar, it's not living on fat. When you cut out the carbohydrates and you're eating a lot of fat, the human body uses that fat as a fuel source, as a source for energy, as a source for substrates to build tissues. Yes, it has to be transported around. So it is the demand from your cells for fat in the absence of glucose that causes your LDL to go up, not the consumption of fat that causes your LDL to go up. Does that make sense? If you are not eating sugar and starch, your body has to use fat. And the problem with diabetes, type 1 or type 2, is that you're not getting the sugar into the cells. So the cells are not seeing the sugar even though your blood sugar is high. So then, in the absence of intracellular sugar for energy, the alternative of the body is to use fat. So your LDL goes up even when you're diabetic. But in my patients who can produce a huge amount of insulin, my IR1 patients, their LDL tends to be fairly low. In my pure carnivores that are type 1 diabetics, the LDL level is fairly low because they're shoving sugar into their cells a lot, keeping their blood sugar low, but they're using sugar as a primary fuel source. But my LMHR, my lean mass hyperresponder patients whose LDL is through the roof, it's because they're insulin suppressed and they're not using sugar. So the body has to use that fat. But the LDL cholesterol is going up not because they're eating fat, but because they're using fat. And that doesn't cause harm. So the whole hypothesis falls apart. Number one, we're not eating what they say they're eating, even when we're eating steak. And number two is LDL cholesterol goes up in the face of a low blood sugar, in the face of low insulin. But that's because the body's using it as a fuel. It's not causing harm. Those people typically have very, very low CAC scores. So the blood vascular stuff that they're saying is happening isn't happening in those people. This is science, folks. The evidence is out there. They don't have the evidence. They have one sentence that is illogical and unrepresented by the truth. And then they force you to take a statin to reduce your LDL cholesterol. That's fat. Know your facts. That's fat with a C. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. If you're interested in consulting with us, if you've been told to be on a statin but you're questioning that, give us a call. We'll check your numbers. We'll talk to you about what you can do to reduce your cardiovascular risk without the use of a statin. But you've got to know your risk and know what it is that's contributing or reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease. We can help you with that. Set up a consult. Text us, WhatsApp us, anywhere around the world, 561-517-0642. And we'll get back with you and get an appointment set up. We do it by self-pay. We do it through all insurances in the US. All commercial insurances. Give us a shout. But know the truth from our side as well as their side. Then decide for yourself. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. Till next time.